So it was Climate Day at the White House, which in the president's mind, it means jobs days. I don't know jobs for whom, but I'm sure somewhere somebody's told him somebody will get a job there from it. Joining us now from the Heartland Institute, Senior Fellow for the Environment. You can read his stuff at climaterealism.com. What a heretic website that must be. Anthony Watts is on the show with us. Anthony, thank you for joining us. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, and I'm glad you're enjoying a couple of feet of global warming back there.
Yeah, exactly. Well, as somebody said, Groundhog Day, which just passed, is a celebration of the original creator of all the science that global warming is based on. Let's pick up the marmot and see if you see his shadow. And I believe, I'm not sure, don't hold me to this, that was what Michael Mann was doing when he made the hockey stick graph. Anthony, so with the stroke of a pen, the president unemploys tens of thousands of people, shuts down a pipeline that, as far as I can tell, the natural gas is still going to be transported. It's just going to be put in trucks and trundled down the highways, which maybe that's what he means, the jobs for the over-the-road truckers. I'm not sure where his jobs idea come from, but you just wrote a piece that you've actually done something that a lot of climate people don't do, taken the data, chewed on them, and are showing even declines in mortality rates that can be attributed to climate change, correct?
Yes. In fact, while people, while media and some of the activist people continue to scream about climate change is causing more deaths, more destruction, and so forth and so on, when you actually look at the data, you find that their claims are completely untrue. And they are based on fear-mongering. But I can tell you this, that the ability for us to adapt to weather, adapt to extreme weather events is far better than it used to be because we have better warning systems. We've understood how storms react. We've hardened our infrastructure. There's lots of things that we've done to help survive weather compared to what we've had in the past. And so the mortality rate has plummeted as a result of that knowledge and work. And then you talked about, the natural gas coming from Canada. Well, it's not just natural gas, it's oil too. And what a lot of people don't realize is that the Warren Buffett Corporation is a big owner in trains and railroads. And so a lot of this oil that's coming from the oil sands of Canada into the United States, which is the reason for this pipeline, is going to be transported by trains. And Warren Buffett is a big donor to all sorts of democratic causes. And a lot of this had to do with simply revenue protection and nothing to do with climate.
Well, Berkshire Hathaway for some time owned a lot of Virginia newspapers, owned a lot of newspapers in general, but a lot of them in Virginia, and they all took editorial stands against pipelines through Virginia, and that was pointed out a lot during the time, is that you probably should have noticed that another division of Berkshire Hathaway is the rails that will be used instead. But the president presents this as if, getting rid of this pipeline will stop the use of oil and natural gas. He's even talked about eliminating the use of oil, which I thought we had dispensed with 10 years ago as silly, empty politician rhetoric, because given all the things, it's not just the gasoline our cars run on, it's so many things that we make with these hydrocarbons.
Oh, yeah. I mean, things, cell phones would not be possible without petroleum. Not at all. I mean, much of our modern lifestyle, computers, cell phone, microwave ovens, washing machines and dryers wouldn't be possible without petroleum to make plastics and to make specialized chemicals and insulation and all sorts of things. We are not just from an automobile standpoint dependent on petroleum, we're from an entire infrastructure standpoint dependent on petroleum. And so, but the crazy part about all of this is the United States has been leading the way for the last decade in carbon dioxide emissions reduction. There was a report put out in December that showed, it's called a GAP report, and it was put out by the EIA, the Energy Information Administration, and they showed that the United States continues to drop in its production of carbon dioxide, which is claimed to produce global warming. But at the same time, we're getting these draconian actions, like canceling pipelines and throwing people out of work to further reduce it. But at the same time, China, Russia, India, and other major players are increasing their carbon dioxide emissions, and they are laughing at us behind our backs because they're making these completely bogus promises, for the Paris Accord, saying, "Oh, we're going to reduce our carbon emissions too. We're going to be a good player and a steward of the earth." Ha ha ha. Well, they do that, make those promises, and then they don't keep them. The United States is now back into keeping promises and actively going after, hydrocarbon and so forth. And we're going to be a laughingstock, and our price of oil is going to go up. We're going to see $5 a gallon gas not too far from now in the West. In California, and it's likely we're going to see $3 to $4 a gallon gas in much of the Midwest and the East, probably within a year.
When we talk about China and India as well in their contribution to pollution, and I'd like to go back to the arcane use of the word pollution because all this other stuff just seems like it's gift wrapping around a population control agenda. But the idea of polluting, the idea of something that it's going to defoul a river or make it harder to breathe the air. You bring up China and again India, and in the Paris Accord, they're considered developing nations. Yet I'd argue that a large percentage of the rest of the globe's products are manufactured there. How are they still determined to be a developing nation?
I don't know who comes up with that label or how it's defined, but yes, in some ways, China still is a developing nation. If you've visited China, as I have, you'll see that there are major metropolitan centers that have all the amenities we have here in the United States, and sometimes even more. But there's a huge swath of China that continues to be without basic electrical power, clean running water, and so forth. And it's the same way in India. And Russia has it better in some ways because, they had central planning way back when, which did provide for some of those things. But the point is that it's kind of a dichotomy in these countries. Some parts are very highly developed where they manufacture things, and other parts are still back in the 1800s in terms of how they live.
Well, let me ask you this. Russia, I think, benefits the most from what it sounds like the president's agenda is leading us to, because that is what Putin, aside from his brutal sort of quasi-dictator behavior, has brought the Russian economy back on natural gas and oil for Europe. And once we became an exporter, that really challenged his ability to keep his economy going.
Exactly. Gazprom, which is the Russian company for natural gas, is a state-owned company for the most part, and they are highly competitive in supplying Europe with gas, natural gas, and other products. And so basically the United States, being an exporter, because we were able to utilize fracking to produce far more product than we used to be able to, became a major competitor and a thorn in the side of Putin. So basically, they wanted to shut us down. And a lot of these anti-fracking groups that are out there are being funded and driven entirely by the Russians. They keep screaming about Russian interference, Russian interference. Well, it's here in the form of trying to get the United States to ban fracking so we stop producing as much and stop being an exporter. It's all about the money. Follow the money.
Yeah, absolutely. Anthony Watts is on with a senior fellow for environment and climate at the Heartland Institute. Just published a report after 100 years of climate change, climate-related deaths approaching zero. That's right, you heard the title correctly. I want to circle back to something because every time we hear the left talking about climate change, I hear population control. I think it was Václav Klaus's book, Blue Planet in Green Shackles, talked about, this is global socialism, but it's also global socialism with sort of that technocrats approach to there are intellectual haves and have-nots, and we have too many gosh darn people here. And that's when they say, carbon producing, they mean us. They mean humans and our carbon emissions. And so maybe that's the problem, is we're not dying from climate change fast enough for these folks who want to do population control.
That sounds absurd on the face of it, but you're not far off. Seriously.
That's the trouble with this, is the more absurd it sounds, the less it's unlikely, right?
Yeah. there's a long history of people that are in the climate movement that talk about the need for population reduction, and they talk about how humans are actually a scourge on the planet, totally oblivious to the fact that they're a human themselves, and they're out using their cell phone in their car and all this stuff. But it becomes an elitism sort of a thing, where, well, I'm saving the planet, therefore I'm worth saving. The rest of you, great unwashed, you just need to be eradicated because you're consuming too much and emitting too much and so forth and so on. Seriously, that's how some of these people think.
Well, and it's the central planning that Klaus brought up, which is do you need to drive your car there? Do you need to keep your heat on? Do we have, control, we have our smart thermostats now, so we can monitor load, and at some point nobody would ever consider a government saying, yeah, you really don't need your temperature up at 70. I think 66 is just fine for you, and things like that. But those controls are all going in there, aren't they, Anthony?
They are slowly being put in. The way that you lose freedom is that you take it away in tiny little bits, and that's what the government and the bureaucrat and the activists have been doing. They slip in little things day after day, year after year, and eventually it adds up to something big, and that's what they keep trying to do by slipping in control, smart meters, smartphones, smart everything. When I go out to buy a new product, I immediately avoid anything that has the word smart, green, or eco in it because I know there's an agenda behind it.
Absolutely. So your report talks about the number of climate change related deaths approaching zero. How high had the number been? And take us into the nuts and bolts of your research on this.
Well, the numbers used to be staggering. I mean, the losses from hurricanes, for example. Let's see, there's the hurricane in Galveston, Texas, for example, and I'm looking that up right now, so I have. So
it was a couple of years ago.
Number. But that happened back around the turn of the beginning of the 20th century. The 1900 Galveston hurricane.
Okay.
And that thing killed. It left 10,000 people in the city homeless out of a population of 38,000, destroyed 3,600 homes, and it estimated, they didn't get a good count because a lot of people were simply lost, 6,000 to 12,000 fatalities.
Wow.
Now, the Galveston hurricane, if it happened today, it would immediately be blamed on climate change, right?
Yeah, of
Much
course.
like they did with Katrina. But what happened with the Galveston hurricane is that there was no warning for most of these people that lived in this, this little shoal, which is basically what Galveston is. It's a sandbar off the coast of Texas, very low. And so it got completely overrun by storm surge and everything else because there was no warning. Now, today, we have satellites, we have radar, we have spotter planes, we've got ships at sea, all this stuff that's telling us where these hurricanes are going and their intensity. And so we're able to track very effectively, ahead of time and get people out. In the case of Katrina, we had an idiot for a mayor down there who wouldn't get people evacuated, and that's why there were so many deaths and so forth. And there were other issues with the infrastructure. But the point is that we're better now at warning for weather, knowing ahead of time, and dealing with it. 100 years ago, we had no such thing, and so deaths were much greater related to weather. Weather, by the way, is not climate, though a lot of activists try to make it that way.
Right, and you're making the stipulation that, okay, if we're going to blame a hurricane, a severe hurricane that makes landfall on climate change, here's what we're seeing. I mean, my brother-in-law works for Verizon in New Jersey, and he said it's ridiculous some of the homes that were destroyed and we're looking for government bailout from Superstorm. We can't even call these Sandy because they're 4-story all glass buildings that had no right being built right next to the ocean front. But over time, zoning and planners started looking the other way because somebody would buy some very low, single floor 2-bedroom bungalow by the beach and say, well, now I own property, so I'm just going to build up on this building. And nobody said, hey, that's probably not safe to do. So all that property damage money was based on buildings that had no right and no sane person would have ever nominally built by an oceanfront shoreline.
Exactly. Normalized property losses, when you look at it over time, are also lower compared to what they were a century ago. When we say normalized, we're taking into account inflation and other factors. There's a fellow by the name of Dr. Roger Pielke Jr. who does studies on this, and he's demonstrated time and again that the normalized damage losses associated with hurricanes is actually lowered. He gets excoriated for this because it doesn't fit the narrative, but that's the facts.
Right. And of course, you see the damage and you say, oh, my gosh, my heart breaks. And the rest of us, the 99% that didn't get affected by whatever storm, think, oh, my gosh, I hope that's not me. And then the politician shows up and says, well, contribute to my campaign. I'm going to fix it so it never is you. And we fall for it.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of the problems associated with storms like Hurricane Sandy, and I refuse to call it Superstorm Sandy because that's just a label that they use to make it seem even bigger and scarier. It was a Cat 1 storm when it made landfall. It just hit landfall in a place that was prone to flooding and problems. But the point is that we went through a huge drought of hurricanes from the time of 2005 when Katrina hit in New Orleans to just around 2015 or 2016, we had a drought of hurricanes hitting the United States, big hurricanes. It was unprecedented in the history of the record. Even though people like Al Gore were saying in 2005 and 2006, superstorms like Katrina are the new normal, expect huge damages and so forth and so on. Didn't happen. These guys never let a good crisis go to waste. They will take climate change and apply it to any weather event if it suits the narrative.
Well, yeah, and that's the bigger problem is the narrative gets suited and we all wind up paying for it. It doesn't do anything either. And I guess that's the joy of this con is that it's so far removed from ever having to be, held up for scrutiny. Nobody ever really knows if it came true or not because how are you going to know? You're not going to be around in 150 years to see if we had a 0.1% decrease in the temperature of the ocean water.
Right. There's no accountability in climate forecasts because they're so far out. And, the goalposts keep getting moved. The United Nations came out and said that entire nations would be wiped off the earth due to sea level rise in 20 years back in 1989. Yeah. They said this, right? They stood behind it. Well, they're all still there, including these little island nations out in the middle of the Pacific like Tuvalu, which were supposed to be long gone from sea level rise, when in fact what these islands are doing, they're turning into a bigger tourist trade. Come see us before we're gone due to climate change. They've been building new airports, new hotels, begging the UN for money, and they've been getting it. And it's a giant scam. That's what this is.
Well, and I remember reading something a couple of years ago about Norfolk being, one of the key areas of Virginia, and everyone said, this is a national security. This is the premise of the whole national security thing is, our naval stations and air base in Norfolk will be underwater because of climate change. And what was pointed out is actually what's happening is settlement and erosion, not sea level rise. It just appears to be sea level rising because settling and erosion are happening.
That and the fact that, for example, Baltimore has been getting some flooding recently. Well, most people don't know this because they don't study history and science, but there's a giant ancient meteor crater under Baltimore. That's huge. It's
really?
Like 50 miles wide, right? And this thing happened, millions and millions of years ago, but it fractured the rock. All of the bedrock there is fractured, and it's very, very slowly compressing and settling. And that's the reason that there's subsidence, not because the sea level is overrunning Baltimore, but because they built Baltimore on a crater that's shrinking.
Oh, my goodness. I had no idea. I mean, I love days when I learn something new. I had no idea about that prehistoric crater under Baltimore. Well, it explains a lot about Baltimore as well there. But we see this hubris all the time. I used to live on eastern Long Island as the Quag area was eroding away because they had put jetties up along the Brooklyn coastline to protect, the city beaches. And then all of a sudden the normal ebb and flow of the sand stopped going out to the eastern shore. And I worry about this kind of stuff as they talk about wind farms off the shore. I watched them ridiculously try to put a tidal generator off the Delaware coast only to see it almost have immediate impact on the shoreline and the erosion became noticeably greater from that. Is man too smart for our own good, or do we just have we convinced ourselves we're too smart for our own good when it comes to the planet and to weather, climate, whatever you want to call it, Anthony?
Well, I think it's like this. We're good at mitigating on the short term and solving problems on the short term, but because we have limited lifetimes, the typical lifetime of a person is 70 to 80 years, we don't have a long-term retention of learning, of things that have happened in the past. And so we can't remember what it was like living in the Dust Bowl in the 1930s, for example. Most people can't because their population's been thinned out. But the Dust Bowl in the 1930s, we had temperatures in the United States that were unbearable. And there was no air conditioning. We had temperatures that were routinely pegging up above 100 degrees and staying that way for weeks in much of the Midwest and the East. And that was when and that was before climate change was even a word, you know. But how did that happen when the carbon dioxide was so much lower? Well, it was natural variation. The problem that we have is that a lot of the folks that are looking at this think that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is the single control knob. Well, the fact of the matter is that we live in a system that has thousands of variables: sunlight, winds, ocean currents, everything. I mean, there's so many different variables. Clouds, for example. Just a 4% variation in cloud cover can explain the entire global warming change that we've seen over the last 50 years. But we don't study clouds because they don't think clouds are the issue. It's got to be man and his nasty carbon dioxide that he's spewing out of smokestacks and exhaust pipes.
Well, Anthony, it's great. I remember Mount St. Helens in your lifetime and mine, and what it did, for a couple of years because of the dust cloud it created. I appreciate it. Again, read his stuff, climaterealism.com. It's a great piece after 100 years of climate change, climate-related deaths approaching zero. Don't tell too many of your fragile friends about this report, but the tougher ones you can tell about it. Anthony, thank you so much, and you have an awesome weekend.
Thank you. It was my pleasure to be here.
And thank you for tuning in. For all of us here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy, find us online at virginiainstitute.org. My name is Joe Thomas. Until next weekend, so long, and thanks for all the fish.